Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture in this series of lectures on Intro to Linguistics and South Asian languages. My name is Sudheer, as most of you know. So I'm a linguist. So so let's get started. I have some slides which I'll be sharing with you. Yeah. Can you see the slides? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So as I said, this is the first lecture of the course, Intro to Linguistics and South Asian Languages. And so this is the outline of today's talk. So we'll discuss these 4 points today. And I've already indicated this in the brief summary that I sent out. So we'll focus on the first 3 points, and we'll briefly touch upon the last one, which is the history of linguistics. But before we get started, I want to thank the organizers of Quarantine Renaissance for giving us a platform where we can have these very productive discussions, and we can actually, all engage in some kind of collective learning. So I think this is a great initiative. When I came across it, I really felt like this was something that I wanted to be part of. So thank you to all the organizers of this movement. I think this will be, a great thing when we look back on this time a year from now, or, in the future, when we look back and see what we did during the quarantine time. This is something that we'll actually remember. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll start with some basic definitions to introduce what is linguistics. So let's just try to think about this question of what is linguistics. So the answer that we always hear, the answer that we commonly hear is that it's the scientific study of language. So now you can ask the question, what do you mean when you're talking about language? Is it like human language, Arabic, English, Hindi, Latin? Are we talking about these languages? Or what is language? Like, how do we define language, which is the object of study in linguistics? So linguists actually define language as in a very broad sense. So it's an open-ended symbolic system. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? So it means that there is a finite set of symbols, and there are a finite set of operations, which can be thought of as rules or constraints or whatever. So you use those rules to combine those symbols to create potentially infinite set of patterns or messages. So in simple terms, what we mean is, let's say you have a finite set of words. It's a vocabulary of the language. Then you have a set of rules to combine these words, to put them together into phrases and sentences. And by doing so, through these combinations, you can create a potentially infinite set. So you start with finite sets of building blocks. So you have a finite set of symbols and you have a finite set of operations, but then you can create a potentially infinite set of patterns. So you can express many different things using finite means. So this is what Chomsky quotes Humboldt's description of language as a system that makes infinite use of finite means. So what he means is, so language is always open-ended. So you can always create a sentence which has never been uttered before. So in that sense, it's open-ended. But the building blocks of language are finite. So you have a finite set of words, you have a finite set of rules in the language, but we use them in a creative way every day. We use them in a creative way to express ourselves using expressions which we've not used in the past. So we are always creating new sentences, new words, etc. So as we progress in the course, we'll come back to this definition. But I want you to bear in mind that when linguists talk about scientific study of language, this is how they mean it. It is not merely one or two, human languages. Like it's not the study of Arabic or English or let's say, Hindi. So with this definition, let's think about each of these systems. So obviously, yeah, human languages qualify as language. What about sign languages? Are those language as well? You can unmute yourself and maybe try and answer, participate in this. So yeah, so this slide, I think I want us all to think collectively and see if each of these qualifies to be a language.
I would think that all of them would qualify as languages in some definition, right?
Yes. So exactly. So each of them fits the definition of language. So except for maybe road signs, so road sign is probably something where you don't really, so you have individual signs which have a meaning, but can you put together, are there rules for combining road signs? Is it possible? So or each road sign is like a atomic message and you can't really combine them. But yeah, I mean, all of these are potential instances of language. But if you think about it, some of these systems allow for greater expressivity. Sorry? Hello? Okay. So the idea is that although all of these fit our definition of language, there are significant differences. So when you look at human languages, there is a kind of expressivity which is possible, which is not possible in, say, emoji. So when you have emoji, so this is actually a very controversial point. So does emoji constitute a language? Can you put emojis together to create new patterns? And can you create new messages through combinations of emojis? So some linguists say that emoji is not language, and some say that it can be treated as language. Similarly, programming languages like C or Java, so these have very restricted syntax, and they put tight constraints on what can be expressed. So there are significant differences across these different systems with regard to expressivity, but each of them qualifies in our definition of language. So they have some atomic units which can be combined to create a potentially infinite number of patterns. So the interesting thing is that linguists also study animal communication systems. So if you know the famous example of bee dance, so bees, when they dance, it's a very creative form of communication, and they often, so there is Kurt von Frisch won the Nobel Prize for decoding bee dance. So he basically figured out that the direction and the speed with which they dance indicate the distance of the food source. So animals also have very sophisticated communication systems, and those are of interest to linguists. And if you think of music, so music is also a kind of a language, because you have a finite set of scales or finite set of building blocks, and you can create more complex patterns using those finite building blocks. The same can be said of painting and arithmetic. Arithmetic is definitely a language, because you have the numbers, and then you have operations among those numbers to create more numbers. So this is definitely also a kind of an open-ended system which can be treated as a language. In this course, to keep things simple, we'll be focusing mostly on human language. So we'll only be looking at, so most of the time when linguists talk about language, they focus on human language. But this slide is basically, I included it because I want you to understand that language has a very broad definition, and there can be many things which are studied using the techniques that linguists have. So in this course, we'll focus mostly on human language. And so if you think a little bit about human language, so human language is a very complex phenomena. It has many dimensions to it. So it's obviously a cognitive faculty, which is related to reasoning, creativity, and probably even consciousness. And it's a means of communication. So that's very important. So humans are able to communicate among each other, among themselves using language as a medium of communication. It can also be a marker of social organization. So what I mean by this is that you see that language is also, so social groups tend to share language. So members living in a particular region of the world tend to speak the same language, and members of a same social class tend to have a similar language. So there is this social aspect, social dimension of language as well. And it's also a repository for world knowledge that is transmitted across time. So language is the main form of cultural transmission of knowledge. So whatever knowledge we are acquiring, we will pass it down, and that will inevitably use language. So these are the various dimensions, and it's good to think about each of these dimensions, because when we look at the discipline of linguistics, we see that there are different sub areas of linguistics where people focus on each of these different dimensions. So there are linguists who focus on the cognitive dimension more than the other dimensions, and there are linguists who focus more on the communicative aspects of language, and there are those who focus more on the social aspects of language, and there are few who are also interested in the historical. And also, so languages encode all kinds of world knowledge. They also encode knowledge about the ecology, about plants, about fauna, flora in a certain region. So all of those forms of knowledge interface with linguistics. So there are many linguists who work on anthropological questions. So where you go and study the language of a particular group and see how it encodes the world knowledge, which is relevant to the survival of that tribe or relevant to the survival of that group. So that is also an important sub area within linguistics. So we'll come back to this multidimensional aspect of human language time and again in this course. So now, with these definitions of what is language, we will actually see what isn't linguistics, because there are also there are many popular misconceptions, or I shouldn't say misconceptions, but popular confounds about what is linguistics. So we'll look at some of those. But before we do that, I wanted to show you guys a funny video. Let's watch this. Are you still able to see my screen? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, my internet is probably a bit slow. So this is just a funny video on crap. It's going to play the ad, unfortunately. Okay, so that was just a funny video I wanted to show you. It's like the in New Zealand English, in the New Zealand variety of English, whenever they ask a question, if it's a yes no question, the answer is yeah, nah. So some of these questions are just like that. So I just wanted to kind of share that funny bit, that for all these questions that we'll now look at, the answer is yeah, nah. So the first popular, I would say, like perception is that linguists teach grammar. So what do you think is the answer to this? Do you think the job of a linguist is to teach grammar? Yeah, yeah. So I see Francis nodding his head in denial. So yes. So historically, yeah, linguists have been associated with grammar. So grammar again is a very loaded term in linguistics. We'll see, and there are different kinds of grammars. So the grammars which talk about reproducing correct forms. So like the Latin grammar you study in school, which is like, okay, this is how you need to say the word for whatever in this case, and that conjugation, etc. So those grammars are basically prescriptive grammars. So they basically give these correct forms for people to stick to when they speak that language. And prescriptive grammars, although they have been written in the history of linguistics by linguists, that is not the primary focus of linguistics. So we don't want to tell people how to speak. We want to observe people's speech. We want to observe human speech and treat it as a scientific artifact. So we want to treat it just the way a botanist treats like plants, or as a natural object, and analyze it and study it. We don't want to change people's language. We are not trying to do that. So that is the first important. So when I tell people that I'm a linguist, then they ask me, hey, you're a linguist, aren't you supposed to know, is this a grammatical? So grammaticality is not a monopoly. Linguists don't have a monopoly over grammaticality. So every individual, every native speaker of a language has grammaticality judgments. So which forms are grammatical in your language and which forms aren't. And there is no such we have a new person who's okay. Let me just there is no such. Okay, I think we have him. Yes. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so prescriptive grammar is not the domain of linguists. So we don't have to teach people what is the right form versus wrong form. Hi Dan, I think we have started. So can you please mute yourself?
Sudheer, you can also mute.
Hello.
Yeah. So I'm trying to do that now. Okay. So the second misconception about linguists is that they are interested in classical languages or the important languages, like Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, or even this idea that someone is an English linguist and someone is while why is a Spanish linguist, etc. So that is again another misconception. To a linguist, all languages are equally important, and so all languages should be studied in their own right. So we should not impose the analysis of any one language on another language. So this is often preached about, and this is something which, if you ask any linguist, they will definitely admit to this, that okay, we don't do this. But then if you actually examine their beliefs and examine their practice, actually, then you see that there is a lot of problems here. So there is a hierarchy among languages in the real world. We know that. That's because of geopolitical hierarchies, and that's because of historical whatever hierarchies, etc. But we should be very careful to not let those hierarchies affect us as linguists when we are doing linguistics. All languages are equally important, and every language should be studied with the same kind of curiosity and with the same sort of intellectual independence. So it should not be that okay, you have an analysis of Sanskrit, and then you say, oh, but you can use that analysis to analyze all Indian languages. So these are attitudes which are actually not very scientific. As a linguist, all languages should be treated as equal. So this is another thing. So linguists do study classical languages, but that's not the sole job. That's not a prerequisite. So you don't have to study classical languages. You don't have to study important languages. You can be working on a language which doesn't even have a script, which is a spoken language spoken somewhere in the Amazonian rainforest. And you would be doing very important work if you discover interesting facts about human language in that particular underprivileged language. So the third thing is again a very common misconception. This is the idea that linguists need to speak many languages. So this is again a great thing, and it is often the case that linguists speak more than one language fluently, but then it is not a prerequisite to be a linguist. Linguist is someone who observes the patterns in language and analyzes them. So we'll look more into the analytical tools that linguists use, but they don't need to learn more languages. But that said, multilingualism is always a great thing. The more languages you speak, the richer a person you are. But it is not a prerequisite for doing linguistics. So that is another misconception that we should be aware of. So that's the difference between a linguist and a polyglot. So someone who speaks multiple languages is a polyglot, but a linguist is something different. Linguist is someone who is able to take language, any human language, and find some interesting patterns, and is able to come up with an explanation for why those patterns are the way they are. Okay, so with these definitions out of our way, so let's look at some of the major areas of study in linguistics. So yeah, so one major area of study is the structure of human language. So what do you mean by structure? So the language is, human language especially, is a very complex organization. So it has multiple layers of structure. So you have sounds, which are the building blocks of words, and words, which are the building blocks of phrases, and phrases are the building blocks of sentences, and sentences are the building blocks of discourse, dialogue, etc. So you have structure at every level. So words don't randomly combine to become a sentence. There is a certain order. So if you have, let's say, a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. This is actually a fun sentence which was coined by Chomsky to show that you can have sentences combined using rules of syntax, although the sentence itself can be meaningless. So he was trying to argue about the independence of syntax from semantics. So you can have a sentence like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is totally meaningless, but it still feels like a grammatical sentence. So so in this sentence, the words are put together in a certain order. So there is a syntax involved. So you can't have a random sequence of words and call it a sentence. Similarly, at the word level, you will see as we cover more material in this course that there are tight constraints. You can't create a word out of any sequence of sounds. So if you look at English, there are many combinations which are so like if you think of the combination of b followed by n, so something like na, the sound. So this sound you will never find in any English word, but this sound is quite common in many other world languages. So there are rules for each language on how the sounds can be organized to form words. Similarly, even when you move to higher levels of structure, like a discourse or a dialogue, there is always a structure. So when we talk among each other, there is always a structure to the dialogues. There is always a relevance. So if I say something and then you ask something completely unrelated, there cannot be any conversation. So you kind of take the sentence that I uttered and understand its meaning and say something, construct a sentence which is related to the topic that I am talking about. So there is structure even at the conversational level, even at the text level. So linguists have been interested in looking at structure. So different kinds of structure. So all these different levels you have structure. So they have looked at this, and this is quite an old endeavor. So structuralism in linguistics is almost, I mean, so when we get to the history of linguistics part, we will look at various people who have looked at this. But in the modern period, linguists have been looking at the structure of human language for over 100 years now. So another interesting set of ideas in the study of structure of human language is the variation and similarity in structure across languages. So how much do the structures of human language vary? So does Arabic have a different structure compared to English? And does English have a very different structure compared to Mandarin? And what determines these differences in structure? And are there also similarities across languages? Are there things that need to be the same across languages? So this has been a very interesting question that linguists have focused their energies on, and especially the generative paradigm, which was pioneered by Chomsky. This focuses on the rules or the generative mechanisms that combine these finite building blocks of language. So they focus on that, and then they address the question of variation and similarity within that framework. So they focus on the differences across languages with respect to the rules or the generative mechanisms, and how you can account for the surface similarities and surface differences. So yeah, we'll get more to that. So in today's talk, I'll just give you a bird's eye view of the different concepts in linguistics, and we'll have more talks hopefully in this series where we will delve deeper into each of these areas. So then we can actually explore these ideas in much more detail. But for today, I'll just give you like a very high level overview of these ideas. So this slide shows you about the different efforts in studying the structure of language. So structure is one aspect. The second aspect is the relationship of language to the brain or genes. So this area was formerly actually called so there were different areas, there were different names for this area. So it was called psycholinguistics. A few decades earlier, it was called neurolinguistics, because you were looking at the brain and trying to figure out what was happening in the brain when you were speaking or processing a language. And they were also interested in development of language in infants. So how are newborn babies able to acquire language within such a short duration of time? So kids seem to be especially good at learning language. So by the time a human child, a normal in the sense anyone without any kind of developmental deficit, is 4 or 5 years of age, they're already linguistic adults. So linguistic adults in the sense that they can do all the things that an adult can. So they can construct sentences, they construct novel sentences, they understand sentences spoken to them which are fairly complex. So within the first 5 years of our life, we already acquire this ability to speak language. So this is a very interesting topic of study. How do we acquire language so quickly? And there is yet another area, which is, as I mentioned, looking at the brain when you're processing language. So when you're speaking language, which areas in the brain are activated? When you're understanding language spoken by others, again, the same thing, which areas of the brain are involved? And is there, what are the neural correlates of bilingualism? If you have, if a person speaks 2 or more languages, what kind of, brain activity pattern do we observe in that person, etc. So people have studied these things as well. And another very important area is the study of language disorders. So we've had like there are a few language disorders which have been discussed in the literature, and we are discovering more and more of these language disorders as we work on this topic more. So the classical ones are the Broca's aphasia. So Broca's aphasia is supposed to affect speech production. So they have difficulties producing speech like a normal speaker would. And Wernicke's aphasia is it affects the comprehension of language. So these were both discovered around in the 19th century, sometime in the 19th century, and they have been studied for a very long time by linguists. So what is involved in Broca's aphasia, what is involved in Wernicke's aphasia, etc. And there are many more language disorders which I have not mentioned here: dyslexia, dysgraphia, etc. So linguists have focused their attention on studying each of these disorders. And of late, in the last 2 decades, there is actually some work on locating language in the genes. So can you find a gene which is responsible for language? So it seems that there is a gene, and we actually share this gene with many other species. So the same gene, so this gene has actually been called FOXP2. It was discovered at the University of Cambridge, actually. And so this discovery happened in a very fortuitous way. So there was a family of people. So it was actually, they were all members of the same family, and all of them showed the same kind of language impairment. So this was noticed over 3 generations. And so some linguists and actually some neurologists hypothesized that there could be a genetic component to this, that, okay, why is it that several members of the same family are affected by this disorder? And eventually, when they looked at the DNA sequences, the genetic sequences of all these individuals, they were able to isolate a region of their DNA, which they've identified as the FOXP2 gene, where they had abnormalities compared to the rest of the population. So it looks like we are heading in a direction where we can actually talk about language also coming from the genes, or the ability for language coming from the genes. So this is still a very nascent area of research. So we are still at the very early stages. So research is still ongoing. We don't have very many insights into this area. There is also computational linguistics, which has become really popular in the last few years, especially the last decade. So this is looking at the computational and statistical modeling of language. So take phenomena in language and see if you can have statistical explanations and computational explanations. And this area has also focused on building machines that can understand and speak human language. So all the different gadgets that we are using, Siri, Alexa, Google Home. So any piece of technology which interfaces via human language is actually something which is of interest to computational linguists. So the computational linguistics is closely allied with artificial intelligence, because one of the main goals of artificial intelligence was to recreate this human linguistic behavior, or human linguistic, the human ability for language. So computational linguists have focused on that aspect, and they've used methods from statistics to achieve this. So yeah, we'll talk about this in detail when we get to the module on computational linguistics. There is also sociolinguistics, which is a very interesting area within linguistics. So sociolinguists look at patterns of variation in language use. So Bill Labov, who works at University of Pennsylvania, is considered one of the pioneers of sociolinguistics. So he actually proposed a methodology to study how social factors influence variation. So there is this famous novel by George Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion, on which the movie My Fair Lady is based. So you have this girl who is speaking in Cockney, and then this professor of linguistics says that, okay, I'll transform you. That is actually an example of prescriptivism. So that's not an accurate portrayal of linguistics. But the idea is that that movie shows that there is this variation with respect to the social factors. So there is like a Cockney variety, which was considered as the low prestige variety, and then there is RP, which is considered as the high prestige variety. And RP speakers have certain patterns in their language, and so the idea behind sociolinguistics is this variation across these different varieties unconstrained, or are there constraints? Is there a pattern to the variation? So they've tried to fit statistical models. So things like we have certain insights from this area. For example, the R insertion, the intrusive R. So when you say India and Pakistan, in RP they insert an R, India and Pakistan. So the intrusive R, the R insertion, is actually a marker of your social prestige. So you see that oftentimes there are speakers of other varieties who try to use these markers in order to seem like upwardly mobile. So sociolinguists have discovered many such interesting patterns in language use. So we'll talk about these things in detail in one of our sessions. Next, this is my favorite area of research. Actually, this is historical linguistics, and this was actually the mainstream of linguistics for more than 2 centuries, especially during the colonial period when Europeans were colonizing. Certain Europeans were colonizing different regions of the world, and they encountered many new languages. So they were interested in understanding language classification. So whether are these languages related to Indo-European languages, or do they form a different language family, and what are the relationships between these different language families, and what happened to a particular language family which was spoken sometime in the past, but probably went extinct. So these are the kind of questions that historical linguists engage with. So historical linguists are primarily interested in studying how language changes over time. So we know that even English, for instance, if you look at the English of the Chaucer's time of the 12th century, you will find that it's very different from the English of today. So language is constantly changing, and even if every decade it's changing. So if you look at the colloquialisms, 10 years ago there were certain things, certain phrases that were in, and now they are like outdated. The same for um, so there is always change, and that change can again be at various levels. So you can have the pronunciation changing over time. You can have the meaning of words change over time. You can even have syntactic change. You can have the structures of language also change over time. And historical linguists are also interested in studying extinct languages. So you can study languages which have gone extinct, like Elamite or Hittite, or many languages. So you can study extinct languages to infer something about the civilization where these languages were spoken. There is also another field, which is that of language documentation. This is another fascinating area. So here linguists have looked at documenting new languages. So it is approximately, it is said that the world has approximately around 6,000 languages, but this is only an estimate, and we keep discovering new languages every few years. And there are so many areas, there are so many regions of the world where there could be new languages, but we don't know yet. So, so another term for language documentation is field linguistics. So field linguists have traveled to all these remote parts of the world and documented these new languages. And many of these new languages do not have scripts. They are primarily spoken languages. So they've developed scripts for those languages. They've created language resources like dictionaries or texts or recordings, etc. In the case of endangered languages, this is even more important because the language is on its it's in its late stages. It's on its way out. So there are just like a handful of elderly speakers. So you need to do something to kind of keep the language alive. So you need to collect. So as we discussed earlier, language contains so much world knowledge. So when a language dies, all that world knowledge is also lost. So language loss is actually a bad thing. And that is the main issue that field linguists and people working on documentary linguistics are tackling. So we need to revitalize endangered languages, and we need to document endangered languages so that the information so that the world knowledge that is contained in these languages is not lost. Then there is the area of applied linguistics. So this is a very broad label. So what people mean when they say applied linguistics is different things, like language teaching. So it can be teaching English as a second language, teaching English as a foreign language. And it can also be studying the language policy of different states. And also, so linguists are also employed by governments across the world in order to frame language policy, especially in multilingual countries like India, where you have many languages. How do you have a language policy which keeps everyone happy and which makes sure that every language is given its due importance? So these are very serious questions, and linguists have worked on these questions. So we don't have perfect solutions yet, but this is an area where linguistic expertise is really required. So the third thing, I've called it politics of language. So this is another thing which is actually it's a huge issue in the real world. So there are power relations among languages, especially in many of these countries which were affected by colonialism. So you have power relations among languages. So how do you deal with those issues, and how can you even even verbalize those issues? How can you give a fair assessment of the kind of issues that exist? And how can you have an education policy where if it was a region of the world which was colonized, obviously the colonizer used their language to teach people for 2-3 centuries. Just like I'm speaking in English, this was actually something that the English brought to India. So how can I be educated in my own language, and how can I be literate in my own language, and how do you even create content which is like intelligent and which is state of the art for these different languages? So this is something that linguists are heavily involved with. So this is also, it falls under the broad label of applied linguistics. So yeah, so these are the main areas. So just to recap, the most important one and the one that has received the maximum amount of focus over the last century is the study of structure. And then you have this new emerging field which is studying the language and the brain and the genes, etc. And there is also the computational linguistic aspect of linguistics. So where you are trying to build intelligence, where you're trying to build machines that can understand and speak human language. And then there is the social dimension of it, so sociolinguistics. And there is the historical dimension of it. So sociolinguistics looks at variation across social space, and historical linguistics looks at variation across time. So these are similar, but then they're looking at different dimensions. So one is looking at across social space, the other is looking across time. And you have documentary linguistics, language documentation, or field linguistics, which is looking at new languages and revitalizing endangered languages. And then there is applied linguistics, which covers all these other topics which are of crucial importance. So with this brief overview, so I'll get to the final topic for today's talk. So I wanted to give you a brief history, very brief history actually, because I think it's very hard to do justice to a topic like this, like a topic as broad as history of linguistics. But then I want to give you a flavor of what all has happened so that you can explore this area on your own. You can read about these things, and you can explore more of this. So yeah, so when I say history of linguistics, it should not give you the impression that there was like one stream of whatever, like developments which led to the current moment. So there were various things which were happening in different parts of the world, and most of these efforts were like happening independently. They didn't know about other efforts happening in these other regions until very recently, because obviously we didn't have good communication in the past. So when I say brief history of linguistics, so when you take a course like this in academia, they give you like a brief history of Western linguistics, and then, or they give you, if you are doing the course in India, they would give you a brief history of like Indian linguistics, so things like that. So I've tried to touch upon different schools of linguistics that existed in the past and which have done some interesting work. And like I said, this is just to give you a flavor of things. So one of the oldest schools of linguistics is actually from India. So you had Panini's grammar of Sanskrit, which is actually dated to around almost the same time as around the time of Buddha, so around like 500 BC, somewhere around that time. So Panini wrote a grammar of Sanskrit, which actually has all the properties of the modern conception of grammar. So so if you recall the definition, so we talked about these finite set of symbols and the finite set of rules generating a potentially infinite set of patterns. So Panini's grammar was actually formulated along these lines. So it comes very close to the modern conception of grammars in formal language theory, etc. So Panini had a grammar of Sanskrit, which is often celebrated as a work of genius. Then there was Pingala, who was also a linguist. So he looked at meter, he looked at rhythm and in poetry and meter, and he kind of wrote a treatise on the different combinations of syllables to construct different kinds of meter. And there are a few other names. So one interesting work um, on this tradition is Frits Stahl's Reader on the Sanskrit Grammarian. So I would encourage you all to check it out if you're interested. So Frits Staal was a Dutch logician who lived in the 20th century. So he studied at Leiden and then went on to teach at University of California, Berkeley. So he was actually very enthusiastic about the Indian grammatical tradition. He traveled across the length and breadth of India and collected material about this ancient tradition. And he published a reader, which is published by the MIT Press. So I really find that book very informative. And there are many things which you would never read in like a mainstream course on linguistics. Then after the Indian tradition, you also had a lot of work on language in the Greco-Roman tradition. So again, this is a very cursory glance at that because there is so much work that I could not have covered everything. So one of the questions that the ancient Greeks pondered about was the opposition between nature and convention. So there were certain things which were natural, which were occurring in nature, and there were certain things which were due to social convention. So for a long time, the Greek philosophers debated whether language was something natural, which came about naturally, or was it a social convention that humans came up with. So there are these very interesting debates, and you can actually, I would encourage you to read about these debates. There are some very interesting works of linguistics from that era. So Dionysius Thrax was the first grammar of Greek, and Apollonius was the first sentence level grammar of Greek, and Varro and Trician, these were Roman linguists. So you can read about all of them. The most important concept from this tradition that I want you to remember about is Plato's problem. So Plato's problem is again a term that Chomsky has used many times. So this is the idea that when you look at the range of cognitive abilities that humans have and the amount of input they are exposed to as children, there is no parity. So this is the poverty of stimulus argument. So the idea is we are exposed to such little information, but then the abilities that we develop are so rich in comparison. So how is that? So if it was purely through behaviorism, as in like, okay, if everything was learned through reward and punishment, that okay, I spoke a sentence, it was grammatical, and then my parents rewarded me, and I spoke an ungrammatical sentence, they corrected me. If I learned everything through that sort of mechanism, I would never have developed the range of linguistic creativity that I have. So the idea is, so there is a story from the Meno, which is a book which has discussions between Plato, Aristotle, and others. So the idea is that they are discussing about a slave boy who has no knowledge. He's never been educated. But when you show him patterns, when you show him, a right angle triangle, and then you ask him what is the shortest distance from A to B if you had to go. So he knows intuitively that the hypotenuse is shorter than taking the both the sides of the right angle triangle. So he's never been exposed to the Pythagoras theorem, but he knows this. So the idea is Plato uses this as an argument that certain kinds of knowledge are innate. So we have this innate knowledge of many concepts which we do not know. So we don't need any formal education. So you don't have to be taught language. So if you're a human baby, you're born and then you live among humans, you don't have to be explicitly educated in that language. You already start speaking the language like an adult, fully fluent by the age of 4 or 5. So this idea is of central importance in linguistics. So the idea that things are innate. So we'll look at this in more detail when we look at the when we look at the Chomskyan tradition of linguistics. So Chomsky's theory of language is based on this idea of innateness, that we have an innate language faculty, and many things about language are actually hardwired. So we come hardwired with that. So therefore, it doesn't take us very long to figure out how to speak language once we are in this world. So there are other traditions in history. So there was a Chinese school of linguistics, which is over 2 millennia old, but their focus was mostly on the phonetics of Mandarin, of the ancient Chinese languages, and the script, how to adapt the script to write different sounds, etc. There is also a Mesopotamian tradition. So this was around maybe 7th century CE or 8th century CE. So there is a grammar of Arabic, which was written by Sibawayh. I don't know the exact pronunciation of that. So he has a grammar of Arabic, Al-Kitab. So this is actually a very influential work, and this has many concepts which are still in use in modern linguistics. So you have the notion of dependency. So the notion of dependency was also present in Panini's grammar of Sanskrit. It was also there in the Sanskrit tradition, and in the Arab tradition as well, we find the notion. And within the Western tradition, this was an idea which started pretty late. So it was maybe the Prague School of Linguistics which popularized this notion of dependency. So we will talk about these things in the future classes. But what I wanted you to know is that there were many traditions of linguistics in history. So there are many others which I've not mentioned here. So coming to the early modern period. So these are a few things that we should know about. So there was Port-Royal grammar in France. So this was a Cartesian school of. So this was based on Descartes' rationalistic principles. So this is something that Chomsky has often credited as being the first Cartesian school of linguistics. And so Chomsky sees himself as a rationalist. So he is more in Descartes' school of thought than the empiricist. And as I mentioned, there was a big emphasis on the historical aspects, historical linguistics during the colonial era. So one of the interesting things that happened during the 18th century, so 1761, William James, who was an officer for the East India Company, who was stationed in India, he was learning Indian languages in his free time, and then he discovered that Sanskrit, which is like one of the classical languages of India, had an extraordinary similarity to Greek and Latin. So he then proposed this idea of all these languages descending from a common ancestor, and this is the family which is known as the Indo-European family of languages. So this was like a fascinating discovery in those times, and that led to a whole movement of historical linguistics for the next century or so. So there were various people who worked on this, like Humboldt, Jacob Grimm, August Schleicher. So all of these linguists were based in Germany, and they were working on these problems. And there is also the neo-grammarian tradition, which was looking at different mechanisms of sound change, etc. So as I mentioned, the focus of these linguists was primarily on historical linguistics and philology. That was how they used to call, the comparative study of language and the historical study of language. In those times, it was called philology. And in the 20th century, so fast forward to the 20th century, the most important thing that happened was Saussure's course in general linguistics. So Saussure was a Swiss linguist who was also a Sanskritist. So he had studied Sanskrit for a long time, and he taught Sanskrit at the University of Geneva. And he wrote a short book. He actually didn't even write the book. So he gave a series of lectures. He was a very reclusive personality during his lifetime, and he died very young. So he used to give these talks. And so two of his students thought that the material in the talks was like pretty original and it was really amazing and it should be written down. But Saussure himself never published it. So after Saussure died, his students published his lecture notes as a book, which became a very influential treatise. So it's called the Course in General Linguistics. So Saussure was the one who brought the focus back to the structure. So till then, it was more of the historical aspects of language, historical linguistics. Saussure changed the focus from the historical aspect to the structural aspect. So he explicitly said that the task of a linguist should be to study the relationship between the form and the meaning. So that was his idea. So there was also the Prague School of Linguistics, which was a highly influential school of linguistics. And you had American structuralism and behaviorism, which lasted for over, it was almost 3-4 decades, from the 1930s to way up to like 1960. This was very, very popular. So you had figures like Edward Sapir, Leonard Bloomfield, actually, and then Maurice Swadesh, etc. So this was also a period of great interest in Native American languages, so American Indian, Amerindian languages, as they used to refer to these languages during that era. So they documented a lot of Amerindian languages, and there was a lot of work done. Around 1957 is when Chomsky's Syntactic Structures was published, and he pioneered a new kind of tradition which focused more on the cognitive aspects. So he said structure is good, but then the structure has to be grounded in some sort of theory about the biological foundations of language. So Chomsky came up with this notion of innateness of language. So he said that humans are born with an innate language faculty, and that innate language faculty is hardwired with a universal grammar, and that universal grammar can account for the grammars of individual languages. So this was a very popular idea. This became very, very popular, and then in no time, it was like it became the mainstream of linguistic theory, of theoretical linguistics. And then there was an era of grammatical formalism. So Chomsky's another of Chomsky's contribution is he said that in order to study language as using the scientific method, you need to have a formalism where you can actually which you can use to make predictions, just like any other science, like as in physics. So you're able to make scientific predictions. You are able to make precise predictions about the distance between planets if you're an astronomer, or things like that, and you could actually verify those things through experiments. So Chomsky's idea was that we should have formalisms which allow us to do that. And yeah, so this is still a very debatable topic, whether the formalisms have allowed the scientific method to be applied, and do we have. So there have been many formalisms. So GB is a formalism that Chomsky proposed, and minimalism as well. And there were several other formalisms which were proposed by Chomsky's colleagues, who were equally brilliant. So there is Ivan Sag, who proposed HPSG. He was actually Chomsky's student. LFG by Joanne Bresnan, who is at Stanford. She is also Chomsky's student. TAG by Arvind Joshi. CCG by Mark Steedman. Optimality theory by Prince and Smolensky. So optimality theory is a phonological theory. So it focuses mainly on the sounds of language rather than the syntax. But you could also do, syntax using this form. So yeah, we will get to these topics. I'll briefly touch upon these topics when we do a course on the structure of language. So while all this was happening in the US, there was also a strong movement of linguistic typology in Europe. So like in the continental Europe, so Max Planck, Leipzig, and many other places in Europe, there was linguistic typology, which was like study of the types of languages. So this was a bit similar. So the goals are kind of similar, but the methods are very different. So while Chomsky's approach to looking at universals in language requires a formalism. Linguistic typology doesn't require an explicit formalism. They look at surface similarities across languages and try to see if there are correlations between different properties of language. So this is another very interesting area, and so they're also often referred by the under the rubric of functionalism. So functionalism is the idea that the function to which the language is put can be the explanation. So while Chomsky's theory is a formal theory, so it doesn't make reference to the function to which the language is used. So they give explanations about linguistic form only based on the form. They don't look at what's the function of this utterance. So that's the difference between the formal approach and the functional approach. And in recent times, over the last 2 decades especially, you have had explosion of work on statistical and computational methods. And in the last 10 years, we've seen like almost a total craze for neural networks and training neural networks to simulate language behavior. So yeah, the only thing I would like to say with regard to these recent, so even I work on these methods for my bread and butter, so I'm not going to say that they are not good, but the idea is that as long as these methods do not model the creative aspect. So when we discussed the concept of language, we said that it is the property of making infinite use of finite means. It's a system that makes infinite use of finite means. So we need to we need to unravel what are the mechanisms which allow us to do that. So computational methods have focused on recreating the patterns that we have. So the set of the potentially infinite set of patterns that you can create, the number of sentences that you can create. So you can train a neural network to construct sentences the way a human being does, but can you build a neural network which constructs sentences using the same mechanism as humans do? So we haven't done that yet. So I think it's still very early, and we are still learning about these methods, and this is a relatively new area, but nonetheless it's a very exciting area, and that's the direction that everyone is seems to be going in. So yeah, time will tell whether that's the best use of time. So yeah, so I think that's all I have to say about the history of linguistics. But I'd encourage you. So when I was preparing my slides, I looked at Encyclopedia Britannica. So they have an interesting article on the history of linguistics. So maybe you can look at that. Or I would say, like, you can even start with Wikipedia and look at the history of linguistics article. And yeah, so Wikipedia is a good starting point, but it is not always reliable. So as you all probably know, so I would say that, okay, use Wikipedia as a starting point, and then get the references to works by linguists, and then check them out if you find them interesting. But yeah, so today's lecture was mainly to give you an overall flavor of the course, overall flavor of the field. And as we proceed, I would actually be looking to you guys to give me some feedback. So which are the topics that you want me to cover, and which are the topics that you would like me to start with. So even the order in which we want to go. So I think I'll be relying on feedback from you all, and based on what you want, we'll keep the ball rolling. I think that brings me to the end of today's talk. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And I think if you're asking me a question, just unmute yourself, and also switch on your video so that we can all see you while you speak. Did you find this useful at all, or was this information that you already knew?
I think it was really useful. It was a lot of new information for me, for sure.
Okay, that's great to hear.
Yeah, it was very useful. I just wanted to know if tracing back the history of languages could help us determine the origin of human.
Can you repeat the question? So, knowing about the history of languages, can it help us?
If it,
I missed that
yeah,
part.
if it could help us detect the other civilization and therefore determine the origin of humans.
Yeah, yes, definitely, definitely. I think that's one of the interesting questions that historical linguists strive to answer. So we want to look at migration patterns in ancient world. So what's the homeland of a language family, and so the language families that went extinct. So for instance, Elamite is a language family which was spoken in southern Iran. So it's extinct. So what can we learn about that civilization? What were the achievements of that civilization? What were the intellectual achievements? Did they know about mathematics? Did they know about arithmetic? What kind of architectural knowledge did they have? So we are trying to understand. We are trying to answer those questions by studying dead languages, extinct languages, and trying to decipher their scripts and trying to know about the origin of. So yeah, so migrations in the ancient world is a big topic that is of interest to historical linguists. So there are many interesting theories actually. So there is a theory which says that there was a language family which was Afro-Asiatic. So so they say that there was at some point there was a language family which was common to both Africa and Asia, and eventually through across time. So as time progressed, they split into two different language families, but there was a proto stage. So when we have a module on historical linguistics, we will look at these questions: that how do we judge if two languages are related? How do we judge? Can we infer the time depth based on the degree of similarity between two languages? So we will look at those questions. And yes, that's a very valid point that you made. It is a topic of great interest by studying older languages, by studying extinct languages, by decoding scripts, undeciphered scripts of extinct languages. We can unravel the mysteries of the past.
Okay, thank you very much. And if this is the case, I was just thinking, if taken in consideration, Ethiopian language is a case because since the oldest human remain was being found in Ethiopia, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
probably it's going to be very interesting to kind of consider taking African languages in consideration into this
Mm-hmm.
research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, indeed. I think so. It
Okay.
would be very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. The discussion was very interesting, and I thank you for this information.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Sudheer.
Hello, Francis.
Hi. I'm just wondering about the role of, say, translators or interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Japan, and the role of interpreters, some of the translators were really bad, even though they'd lived there for many years.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect linguistics, and how authentic is linguistics? Because can we really translate Latin or languages? Because I know in Japan, some of their translators, they can't even translate properly.
Right. Yeah, so I probably missed out on that when I talked about applied linguistics, because translation studies was a big area, is still a big area in applied linguistics. So there is the obvious question that you asked, that two languages differ in such fundamental ways that it is impossible to translate the message in one language with 100% accuracy into another language. So this is a question that people have asked. So this is so Quine, a philosopher, so Quine Gawagai problem that, okay, so does language, so this is also known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that languages influence worldview to an extent that speakers of different languages view the world differently, and therefore translation between languages is almost impossible. There will always be, translation will always be lossy, because you have to lose the nuances and lose the particular, richness of one language in order to transmit the message into another language. But I think I am a bit skeptical of that idea, because you can still, so one thing, so this is the theory, but the practice aspect of it is also, so in language teaching, there is this idea of grammar translation method. So when you are teaching a language, when these translators are learning a second language, if they are taught using translation tasks rather than, so there are different ways of teaching language. So when you teach English as a second language, there is many different ways. There is some ways focus more on the fluency of speech, some focus on comprehension of written text, etc. So there is a way of teaching English where you focus more on the translation aspect of it. So you teach English to speakers of Japanese by making them translate passages of Japanese into English and vice versa. So that is one way. If they were taught English that way, they would probably have they would be able to translate with a bit more ease. But that said, this question of whether you can actually translate with 100% fidelity between languages, and so the idea is also that if the languages are very different, like you mentioned Japanese, so Japanese and English are very different. They come from different language families. They come from different regions of the world. So there is a lot of cultural differences as well. So it might be really hard to convey everything that is conveyed in a Japanese sentence in English. So that might be there. So the differences in connotation and the differences in the cultural associations might not be translatable. But I think if you're looking only at the message, so if you look at the information content, so maybe that can be translated to a large extent across languages. Does that answer the question?
Yes, but I guess we can discuss it more some other time. Also, a lot of the translators are actually quite immature when they move to a different country, to a foreign country.
Yeah.
And their ideas haven't been maybe formed fully in their own culture. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of this, that they lose a lot of their own culture, and then they have a superficial understanding of the foreign culture. Mm-hmm. So it's just something that maybe we can discuss some other time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that is translation is indeed like one of the most difficult aspects of, so bilingualism, multilingualism, these are very interesting areas. So a translator is by definition bilingual. So I don't have any special insight into how an ideal translator should work, I would say. Yeah, but we can take this offline.
Okay.
Any other questions?
What? We actually do have a Japanese speaker with us. I don't know if she wants to offer any comment on Yolanda?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Yo.
If you like. Oh, I think maybe her video is frozen.
I read a book in Japanese slowly, and then I read it in English. But in English, it was so dry and uninteresting. In Japanese, it was really alive. So there's Gabriel Garcia Marquez, his translations from the Spanish are alive, and it's like just reading his words. So you can really understand what he's talking about, 100 Years of Solitude, etc. But, we lose out by some, if the translators do a bad job, we lose cultures nearly, we get a wrong impression of cultures.
Yeah. I think, that is very true.
Yeah.
That is very true. Any other questions? Any other comments? And what? Any other suggestions about what our next talk should be about?
Actually, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something about sending some articles. I didn't know if you wanted to make a suggested reading list or something to share.
Yeah, I can do that. So I can share articles. So so I'll probably just mail those to you, or I could even give the link here. I could give you the link here in the chat window. So
yeah, sure. As you like it, you can offer it if you want to write it here, and then we can also post it on Facebook if you like.
Yeah, I think probably that is a better idea, because I think that will make it easier for people to keep track. Because if once we close this meeting, I think they wouldn't be able to access if I posted it here on the chat. Yeah, so yeah, that's probably a better idea.
Okay.
How do you like this course, Sarah?
I love it. Yeah, I think it's really great. I'm really excited for it. Do you think you want to do it as a kind of weekly, maybe this same time? Is it something, or do you want to maybe play it by ear? How do you like?
I think weekly would be good, but time I need to kind of check my calendar. So today is I have an off day today, so I was able to do it at this time. But then maybe next week I won't be able to do it at the same time. So I'll keep you posted about the time. We have somebody who has just joined the meeting. Yeah. Anyone has any suggestions for the next lecture? What should we be talking about? So we discussed the range of things today. So which topic would you want? So maybe we can have a poll later. So we'll just have a few topics, and then everyone can let me know which of those topics you want me to cover in the next class. But yeah, if you have any suggestions, if you have anything interesting that you have read and you would like to discuss that, please feel free to bring that. We can discuss that as well. And so next time. So yeah, today we didn't have a chance to look a lot about. We didn't actually look at any data from South Asian languages. So maybe next time we will, when we dive deeper, we will actually look at data from South Asian languages. We will discuss about like the linguistic situation in South Asia, probably look at the different languages spoken and the history of each of those language families, etc. So that can be an interesting topic to explore.
Great. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
really
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Hello,
so if there
Sudheer.
are no further questions, maybe we can.
Sudheer.
Yes, Francis.
I would like to hear on phonetics and computational linguistics.
Okay. Okay, so I think we will definitely have a module on phonetics,
Okay.
and so yeah, so I will cover both these topics. So we'll do it. We'll do a course on phonetics as part of the structure. So when we look at the structure of language, so we'll cover phonetics there, and then we will also look at computational methods. So did you have any specific topics? So these are like these are relatively big areas. So did you have any topics that you wanted me to cover?
Because when we want to in specific application like speech recognition, how we recognize the phonemes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when we have new words,
Mm-hmm.
how do we do pronunciation for that?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Okay,
want to
so
know
these are a
like
bit more, yeah, these are a slightly more advanced topics, and we will try to get to these, but then you can always, feel free to ask me these questions offline, and I can point you to resources. But
okay.
because if we get into, I mean, if we get into a lot of detail, then maybe the course content would not be very, generic, and the others would not enjoy it. So I can see that you have, a specific research area in mind. So if we dive too much into that, then maybe the course won't be like a intro to linguistics. So I think, yeah, I will touch upon those things, but then we can explore more of that in offline discussions.
Okay.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you'll send a poll?
Yeah, I will send a poll.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
okay, I'll comment there. Thank
Hi.
you.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I will
Good
send the
job.
poll. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yo-Yo, did you want to say something about Japanese? I think your mic wasn't working and then it dropped. I don't know if you had something that you wanted to add.
Oh,
No pressure, of course, but just in case you wanted to.
I don't know. I was wondering if he saw like the post that we made yesterday. That's why he, like, how did he know that I'm studying Japanese right now? I'm actually studying it. I'm not like a native speaker or anything. But and then I was just interested in the topic. Like translation would be, that's what I would put in the poll. I was gonna wait for the poll also, but yeah, I'll say here, like, I like translation. So I don't know, when you're talking about using Japanese as an example, and then someone made a comment, like, I was just thinking about how who I don't, sorry, I don't know everyone's names yet, but someone was saying he read a Japanese translated book of poetry.
Yeah.
And so I was just thinking about one, like, sometimes I read Japanese and I feel like I would never say this sentence this way, because as an English speaker, like, we don't think like that. Like, I wouldn't phrase it, in this order. So it's about how you express it, I think. Like, that's what I was thinking. In Japanese, there's definitely ways of expression that just, I feel like we don't think that way in English, but it makes sense. So just the idea of how nuances are lost, like you were saying in translation, I think is really interesting. And then, yeah, when that comment came up about poetry, I think maybe Japanese, but I've heard about how Arabic and Persian, especially, and also Hindi, actually, like they have they're languages that have so many, like one word can have so many different meaning and so much nuance, that poetry is just it's something else in their language. And so it actually, yeah, something that makes me really want to learn those languages is to be able to read their poetry, because I think they make it sound like it's another level of writing. Yeah, I don't know. Just I was thinking about those things. So I would if I can say it here, I would like to learn more about translation and just more about what you have to say about it. I find that really interesting. But yeah, thank you. It's great that you're willing to teach us and give your time.
I'm happy to be part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you can teach Hindi, that'd be cool too. Or if we just learn some
I
Hindi,
can.
that'd be
I
fun.
can.
Cool.
Even Aditya can teach Hindi. He is here, so he's a native speaker of Hindi. So
Yeah. Or do you have other dialects actually? Cause
so Hindi has many dialects. So so there are many interesting differences. If you look at so this is something that I always say. So if you look at English words borrowed into Hindi, so there is a very interesting pattern of how the words are mispronounced. So in the Western dialects of Hindi, a word like school, they would say sakul. And then if it's Eastern dialects, they would say iskul. So they would insert the vowel at the start, iskul, ispoon, istyle, and then
that's true.
So Aditya is chuckling because these are things that are made fun of in India. So if you insert the vowel at the start and say iskul, then they just classify you. Oh, you're an Easterner. You're a whatever Bihari or something. And if you insert the vowel in a different so there are all these differences across dialects in Hindi. And again, you have this sociolinguistic situation where certain dialects are high prestige dialects, certain dialects are low prestige dialects. So everyone's really careful not to sound like a low prestige dialect. So they want to sound like the standard variety of Hindi. I think Hindi is a very interesting language because number one, it's I think it's a Creole. So so this is something we didn't really discuss today. So among languages, there are also in contact scenarios. So there are Creoles and Pidgins. So Pidgin is when two languages come into contact, when speakers of two different languages come into contact and they create a new language. That's a Pidgin. And when that Pidgin has become it has become popular enough and it has become the native language of a new generation, then it becomes a Creole. So, for example, in all these colonized cultures. So Haiti, for example, has a Creole, which is Haitian Creole. Jamaica has many Creoles, Jamaican Creole, Guyanese Creole. So these are very interesting languages. So Hindi actually, I think, is a major language which started off as a Creole. It's like maybe 300, 400 years old. So it was the result of contact between multiple languages. So there were the native Indian languages, and then there was Persian, and there were also languages from Central Asia. So all of these came into contact with each other, and that's how Hindi Urdu was created. And this is another thing which I should mention, that Hindi and Urdu are essentially the same language, but then they have two different names and they have diverged, and this is all just for political reasons. So these are like political dialects, but this is the one and the same language. This is a bit similar to like Serbo-Croatian. So like Serbo-Croatian, I think. So I think Serbo-Croatian was also the same thing, that it was one language, and then because of political reasons, it diverged and it became two different languages. So the same story with Hindi and Urdu. And Urdu is spoken in Pakistan, so they have Persianized the vocabulary, and Hindi, which is spoken in India, they have Sanskritized the vocabulary. They have taken more borrowings from Sanskrit, and they make it sound very much like a Sanskrit origin thing. and the variety which is spoken in Pakistan, they make it sound like it has descended from Persian, but it's actually a Creole language, and you can understand everything perfectly if you listen. If I listen to a television program in from Pakistan, I can completely follow what they're talking about, but somehow it's like supposed to be a different language. So this is again another example of like the politics of language, I guess.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of Creole languages, if any of you get a chance to go to Lisbon in the next, however, even in years from now, recently there was opened a new center for Creole from Cabo Verde. It's called, I'm probably going to say this really wrong, I don't speak Portuguese, it's Centro Cultural de Cabo Verde. And it opened just about 6 months ago. Really interesting, and it's all about preserving the indigenous language of Cabo Verde and also the music style Morna.
I see.
So if you ever get a chance to go there, I would recommend it. The people there are really nice too.
I see. I see. Nice. Any more questions, comments?
And does linguistics, how does it relate to alphabets? You know, there's all the different alphabets in the world, and way of writing. You know, in Japan, like they have like 4 different alphabets. You can have 4 different writing systems in one sentence. How does that relate to linguistics?
It is part of linguistics. So the study of scripts, and so the study of creating new scripts for languages, also studying the scripts and making sure. So most of the scripts are actually, they were scripts which were adapted. So like, for example, if you look at the Roman script, it's used to write like many languages in the world, but then it was, it had to be adapted for each language. Linguists had to work on adapting the Roman script, creating diacritics. So if you have a particular sound which cannot be transcribed using the standard, the 26 letter scheme of English, then you need to create diacritics, etc. So this is something that linguists have worked on, and for a long time, this was considered to be the main thing in linguistics, because, but then we know that script is not the only thing in language. So you also have, the spoken language. So now linguists still work on script, and there are many interesting things. So I worked on a language which is spoken in the Himalayan mountains. So it's called Khasi. It's an endangered language. So I did this when I was doing a master's in India 10 years back. So the script for that language was developed by a Scotsman. So he was there. He was working on a coffee plantation, and the language didn't have a script in the 19th century. So in his pastime, he started, looking at how to adapt the Roman script to that language, and he created, diacritics to transcribe their special sounds, etc. And so the script was created by him. So this is something that is, a very interesting topic. And so maybe I should mention there is also like the area of deciphering ancient scripts. So there are many scripts which have not yet been deciphered. So they may hold like secrets of the ancient world. So like the Indus Valley script has not been deciphered till now. It's around like 5,000 years old, but nobody has been able to decipher it, mainly because the script is, so we have very little left. So we just have like 5,000 small tablets with inscriptions. We don't have a full-fledged text or anything. We don't have anything which is longer than, let's say, 30 characters. So these are very small texts, and from those texts you need to infer what the characters are, whether it's so maybe we can do one lecture on writing systems of the world, and there are differences between the different writing systems. So English is one particular example. So you have so this is like the alphabetic scheme. Then you also have syllabaries. So in South and Southeast Asia, so in English you have one sound represented by one grapheme, but in South and Southeast Asia you actually have one syllable represented by one grapheme. So you will have a symbol for a syllable. You will have ka, one syllable, ki, another syllable, and ki, ku, another syllable. So each of those would be different. So in English, you would just have, you would write it as a K, which indicates the K sound, and then you would have the following. So the building blocks of scripts are different. So in a syllabary script, you will have like, characters for the syllables, but in an alphabetic script, you will have letters. And yeah, so Japanese kanji is much more complex. And yeah, so there are many differences, and there are some interesting stories about scripts. So the French linguist Champollion. So have you read? So I'd recommend this book called The Emperor and the Linguist. So it's a book about Napoleon when he conquered. So when he tried to conquer. I mean, I don't know. I've read that book many years back. My history is rusty, so I don't know if he tried to conquer Egypt. Yeah, I think he tried to. So he found the Rosetta Stone, and then he wanted to know what was on the Rosetta Stone, and the Rosetta Stone had an unknown language, undeciphered script. So he had a linguist in his army. So he carried a linguist with him, Champollion. So he entrusted Champollion with the task of deciphering that script. And yeah, so that there is this interesting book which I read when I first started out, and I got interested in linguistics. So yeah, during my undergrad, so my bachelor's was not in linguistics. So, but then my bachelor's was actually in computer science. But I was very interested in humanities and language because I always wanted to be a writer. So I was reading these books. So there was this book about the Emperor and the Linguist. So it's a very interesting book about how Champollion deciphers the script. So he gets the way he gets the clues and the way he deciphers the script. That's a very interesting book. So maybe you should you can all check it out. So the book is called The Emperor and the Linguist. It's a story of Napoleon and the Rosetta Stone. Francis, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So my question to you is, how different is Irish Gaelic from Scottish Gaelic?
It's similar. I was in Scotland, and I can understand some of the words. So it's the same family, and it's not. I can understand some of the words. Yeah.
So, I see some of the words. I see, but not the sentence. You can't understand the full sentences.
No. And I mean, even my Irish is only basic.
Right.
But but it is similar. It's whereas in Welsh it broke away from Irish and Scottish about 800 years ago.
I see.
And it's much more difficult to understand. Whereas for me, Scotch and Irish language is much more similar.
I see.
Yeah, but Welsh is impossible.
Right.
I don't know anything about it.
Right. I mean, when I was in Ireland, I tried to learn a little bit of the language, so I picked up a few words. So agus is and
yes,
agus is and fair is a boy.
Fair is boy, yes.
Fair is boy. Ban is. So I was watching a program on like Scotland, and they were speaking Scottish Gaelic, and I could pick up those words. Agus, they were saying agus, and I was like, okay, this is there in Irish Gaelic as well. So maybe I should ask Francis that, okay, is the language very similar?
And it's funny, in language, in Irish, they didn't have, say, the directions, was, they would say color. So instead of saying north, they'd say white. So it's a different, conceptually, you could be talking about directions, but you're speaking in colors. So I think it's a beautiful way of thinking. It's, again, wow, it must have been amazing to be in that language. We don't have directions, we have colors in our life.
Colors, right. Wow, amazing. Yeah, I will. Do you have any, are there any interesting novels or stories which show like which give a feel of this Scottish Gaelic culture?
For Scottish, I don't know. I don't really know. Not really. No, not really. No. It's it's a bit old. I mean, a lot of the old stories are old.
So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to tell the others that Francis is like as a repository of Irish knowledge. So when I lived in Ireland, I used to go up to Trim where Francis lives, and he used to take us to these historical places, the Hill of Tara, and all these mythological places discussed in Irish myths. And he used to give like a tour. So he used to tell us that, okay, this is where the kings used to have their banquet, and they used to eat their food here. And it was like amazing because you could actually see everything when Francis was describing it to you. So you could visualize everything. So yeah, he is like, he knows a lot about Irish myths and Irish culture. So
yes,
it was great to hang out with you.
Yes, we have to do it again, Sudheer.
Yeah, I will come back. Okay, so once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this first session, and I will send out a poll, and then we will decide what is the topic for the next talk, and I'll also send you the time. And now that we have done this once, I think from the next time it would be fairly straightforward, so there won't be so much confusion, I guess. And I hope to see you all next week. And
yeah, thank you very much, Sudheer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
To meet you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.